Coraline Beckett had learned that humiliation did not arrive in grand, dramatic moments. It came in the small ones, the quiet ones, the moments that slipped past before you could brace yourself. It came when a cashier looked through her instead of at her, eyes sliding past as though she had already become invisible. It came when strangers in parking lots tightened their grip on purses because she and her daughter climbed out of a dented sedan with blankets piled in the back seat and weariness written across their faces like a language only the desperate could read. It came when Wren, 16 years old and too thin for her age, said she was not hungry even though Cora had watched her stare too long at the smell of fried chicken drifting from a gas station window. But on the morning the lawyer called, humiliation arrived wearing a different disguise. It arrived dressed like hope. The phone rang at 7 in the morning, vibrating against the cracked dashboard where Cora had left it charging overnight. She sat up in the driver's seat, her neck stiff from another night spent half sleeping in a church parking lot outside Maryville, Tennessee. The Methodist Church on Elm Street had become their regular spot over the past 3 months. The pastor knew they were there. He never said anything. Sometimes he left a paper bag of sandwiches on the hood of their car before dawn service, always walking away before they could thank him or feel the weight of gratitude that came with needing help. Small mercies. That was what kept them alive now. Small mercies from strangers who pretended not to see. Beside her, Wren was still asleep in the passenger seat, her cheek pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass in slow rhythmic clouds. A worn notebook lay open in her lap, the pages filled with her small, careful handwriting. She had taken to journaling in the past few months, filling page after page with thoughts she never shared aloud. It was her way of staying sane, Cora suspected. Her way of making sense of a world that had stopped making sense long ago. Wren looked younger when she slept, less guarded, less like someone who had learned to measure every bite of food and calculate whether her mother had eaten enough before allowing herself to swallow. Cora answered the phone quietly, her voice rough with sleep. "Mrs. Beckett?" The voice on the other end was male, older, with the careful cadence of someone who had spent decades choosing words for a living. "Speaking. This is Aldous Pemberton from Pemberton and Associates in Knoxville. I'm calling regarding the estate of Opal Harrington." Cora blinked. The name meant nothing to her. She had a few distant relatives scattered across the South, people she had lost touch with decades ago, but she could not recall anyone named Harrington. "I think you have the wrong number." "I don't believe I do." A pause, papers shuffling. "You are listed as next of kin on one remaining property transfer. Miss Harrington passed away 3 weeks ago, and her will names you as sole beneficiary of her estate." Cora felt her heart stutter against her ribs. Property. The word hit her like sunlight after a long winter. Not money maybe, not a miracle, but perhaps a small house, a plot of land, something they could sell, something that meant this season of sleeping upright in a car, of washing her hair in gas station sinks, of pretending to her daughter that things would turn around any day now, could finally end. She lowered her voice to keep it from shaking. "How much is it worth?" There was a pause on the other end. "Too careful. Too long. I'd prefer to discuss that in person, ma'am. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" By noon, Cora and Wren were sitting in a law office that smelled of leather and old paper, trying not to look like people who had nowhere else to go. Cora had brushed her hair with water from a gas station sink and borrowed a travel-sized bottle of hand lotion from the church's lost and found box to smooth away some of the roughness from her palms. She wore the only blouse she owned that did not have visible stains, a pale blue cotton thing she had saved for job interviews that never led anywhere. Wren sat beside her in a dress that had once belonged to Cora, the fabric slightly too large on her narrow frame, the hem let out twice already. They looked presentable, barely, but presentable. Across from them, Aldous Pemberton opened a thin file. He was older than his voice had suggested, perhaps 62 or 63, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. His office was half-packed, cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, diplomas and certificates wrapped in newspaper and leaning against the desk. A man preparing to close a chapter of his life. There was something tired in his eyes, but also something kind. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty and had not yet made peace with it. "Your cousin Opal passed away 3 weeks ago," he said gently. She lived alone in the Smoky Mountains, outside a small community called Creekstone. Most of her family's long gone, and those who remain, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Well, they were not the sort of people she wished to leave anything to. Cora clasped her hands in her lap so he would not see them trembling. What did she leave? A single structure on inherited land. A cabin. Cora felt hope swell in her chest. A cabin. In the mountains. Even a small one could be worth something. Enough for first and last month's rent somewhere. Enough to stop sleeping in the car. Enough to give Ren a bed again. A door that closed. A place to call home. A log cabin, Aldous continued, his voice careful. Remote. Structurally compromised. He looked up from the file, meeting her eyes with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Appraised at $50. The words did not register at first. Cora heard them, but her brain refused to process them. $50. The number was so absurd it felt like a joke. A cruel, cosmic joke delivered in a leather-smelling office by a man who looked like he had delivered bad news his entire life. 50? Ren asked, her voice small. Aldous nodded once. The cabin has been abandoned for years. It is not considered habitable in its current condition. The county assessed it primarily for the land value, but there are complications with the title that would take considerable time and expense to resolve. As it stands, the structure itself is considered worthless. From the hallway just outside the glass office wall, someone laughed. Not loudly, not kindly either. Cora turned her head just enough to see two young women in smart blazers walking past, one of them murmuring something to the other behind a manicured hand. The words were too quiet to hear clearly, but the tone carried through the glass. Dismissive. Amused. Did you hear? One of them said, just loud enough to reach through the door. $50 for a whole inheritance. The other one laughed again, and the sound faded down the hallway. Cora felt the blood rush to her face. Her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles whitening against the faded fabric of her skirt. A cabin worth $50. After years of scraping by, after losing Hollis, after selling everything they owned, including the wedding ring she had sworn she would never part with. After 11 months of sleeping in a car and pretending to her daughter that things would turn around any day now. This was what the universe had saved for her. One last joke. Cora gave a brittle little laugh of her own, the sound sharp and hollow in the quiet office. So my inheritance is a pile of rotten wood? Aldous shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Beckett, I understand this may feel... No. She stood too quickly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like accusation. You understand paperwork. That's what you understand. You sit in your nice office with your leather chairs and your retirement boxes, and you hand people papers that tell them their whole life is worth $50. That's what you understand. Ren rose with her, one hand reaching for her mother's arm. Mom. But Cora was already turning away, ashamed of the sting in her eyes. She would not cry here. Not in front of polished desks and people with clean shoes and sympathy they could afford to give, because it cost them nothing. I'm sorry, Aldous said quietly. His voice had changed. Softer now, more human. But there is one more thing. Cora stopped, her hand on the doorframe. Your cousin left a note, attached to the transfer documents. She was very specific that you should receive it. He slid a folded sheet of paper across the desk. Cora stared at it for a long moment, her chest tight, her eyes still burning. Then she reached out and opened it with unsteady fingers. The handwriting was thin and old-fashioned, the kind of script they used to teach in schools decades ago. The letters slanted slightly to the right, as though the writer had been leaning towards something just out of reach. To the one who knows the price of a roof before asking the value of gold. Do not sell, do not leave. Listen to the house. That was all. Cora read it twice, then a third time, as though more words might appear if she wanted them badly enough. What does that even mean? She whispered. Ren leaned closer to read over her shoulder, her brow furrowed. Then something shifted in her expression, something quiet and thoughtful. It means she knew who she was leaving it to, Ren said. Cora let out a bitter breath. A broken cabin in the middle of nowhere? That's not salvation. That's not even shelter. No, Ren agreed. Her voice was calm in that careful way she had developed over the past year, the way children learn to be calm when their parents were falling apart. But maybe it's not nothing either. Cora looked at her daughter then, really looked at her, at the girl who had grown too quiet over the past 11 months, too watchful, too steady for 16, at the girl who had learned to make jokes out of pain so her mother would not collapse under the weight of guilt, at the girl who wrote in her journal every night by flashlight because it was the only way she knew to keep herself from disappearing entirely. People laughed, Cora said quietly. Did you hear them? Yeah. Wren met her gaze without flinching. People laugh when they don't know what something is worth yet. The room went still. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Aldous cleared his throat softly. I can provide the address and keys if you choose to inspect the property. It's about 4 hours from here, up in the Smokies. The road is unpaved for the last few miles, but passable in good weather. He paused, removing his glasses to clean them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed more about buying time than about cleanliness. I should tell you, Mrs. Beckett, I've been practicing law for 40 years. I've seen a lot of wills, a lot of last wishes. Most people leave their things to family because that's what you're supposed to do. He looked up at her. But Opal Harrington had family, plenty of it, and she chose to leave everything to you, a woman she'd never met. He set his glasses back on his nose. In my experience, that kind of choice is never random. It means something. I don't know what, but it means something. Cora should have said no. She should have walked away from one more insult disguised as opportunity. But outside, her old sedan sat in the afternoon sun, with her whole life stuffed into the trunk. And inside this office, for the first time in 11 months, something had been placed in her hands instead of taken from them. She folded the note and slipped it into her purse. Fine, she said, her voice low and raw. Show us the cabin nobody wanted. The drive into the mountains took nearly 4 hours, and with every mile, Cora felt the weight of her life pressing harder against her ribs. Their old sedan coughed on the inclines, the engine whining like it resented hope as much as she did. The check engine light had been glowing orange for 3 weeks now, a constant reminder of all the things she could not afford to fix. She had learned to ignore it the way she had learned to ignore so many warning signs over the past year. What choice did she have? The car was all they owned that still moved. In the back seat were 2 blankets, a plastic bag of clothes, a cracked photo frame she had never been able to throw away, and the small cooler that now held everything they had left to eat. Half a loaf of bread going stale at the edges, 2 apples, bruised but edible, a jar of peanut butter with maybe 3 servings left if they scraped the sides carefully. That was the inventory of Coraline Beckett's world at 49 years old. It had not always been this way. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she had a kitchen with yellow curtains and a window that looked out over a small backyard with a maple tree that turned gold every October. There had been a husband who whistled while he fixed cabinet doors, who called her Cora mine because he thought it was clever, who fell asleep on the couch on Sunday afternoons with his hand resting on her knee. While football played on the television, neither of them was really watching. Hollis had worked as an electrician. Good work, steady work, the kind of work that let them buy a modest house in a modest neighborhood and dream small, manageable dreams. College for Wren someday, maybe a vacation to the beach, a new car when the old one finally gave up. Simple things, ordinary things. The kind of things that seemed guaranteed until they weren't. Then one afternoon in March 3 years ago, Cora's phone had rung while she was filing insurance claims at the dentist's office where she worked as a receptionist. A foreman from one of Hollis's job sites, his voice shaking. There had been an accident. High voltage. The safety equipment had failed. A defective harness that should have been replaced months ago. Hollis was alive, but barely. The months that followed blurred together in Cora's memory like watercolors left out in the rain. Hospital rooms with machines that beeped in rhythms she learned to fear. Doctors explaining words like traumatic brain injury and cognitive impairment and long-term rehabilitation with the careful detachment of people who delivered bad news for a living and had learned to protect themselves from feeling it too deeply. Cora quit her job to care for him full-time. There was no one else. Hollis's parents were gone, both of them buried before Wren was born. Cora's mother had died when she was 22, and her father had remarried and moved to Arizona, becoming someone else's family with unseemly speed. It was just them. It had always been just them. Insurance covered some of the costs at first, then less. then almost none, as the policy's fine print revealed exclusions and limitations that seemed designed to abandon people exactly when they needed help most. The hospital bills arrived like avalanches, each one bearing them a little deeper. Hollis died 2 years after the accident, on a Tuesday morning in November, while Cora was holding his hand and reading to him from a book of poems he had given her on their 5th anniversary. He had not spoken in weeks by then, had not recognized her in months, but she read to him anyway because it was the only thing left she could do. He slipped away between one line and the next, his breathing simply stopping, his hand going slack in hers like he had finally found permission to let go. She finished the poem before she called the nurse. She never told anyone that. It felt like a secret, a small, sacred moment that belonged only to them. After he was gone, grief did not come alone. It arrived with debt collectors who called at all hours, their voices professionally polite, while they asked when she planned to pay bills that would take 3 lifetimes to clear. Final notices printed on pink paper. A bank that used phrases like regrettable necessity and unfortunate circumstances to describe the process of taking her home. Cora sold jewelry first, then furniture, then the wedding ring she had sworn she would keep until they buried her with it. She put it in a pawn shop on a Tuesday afternoon and walked out with $300 and a hole in her chest that never quite closed. Still, the house went. Foreclosure. Such a clean word for such a violent thing. After that, life became a string of temporary places. A friend's couch for 2 weeks until the friend's husband started making comments about freeloaders and how long was this going to last exactly. A weekly motel for a month until the money ran out. A shelter for 3 nights until Wren stopped sleeping because she was afraid someone would steal her shoes in the dark. Then the car. Cora kept telling Wren it was just for now, but just for now had lasted 11 months. At a red light somewhere in the foothills, Cora glanced over at her daughter. Wren was staring out the window at a farmhouse in the distance, white paint glowing in the afternoon sun. A family was visible on the porch, a woman in a sundress, laughing at something. A man with a newspaper, his feet up on the railing. 2 children chasing a golden retriever across the grass. "You okay?" Cora asked. Wren nodded too fast. "Yeah." That looked like a lie, but Cora did not push. She had learned that pushing only made Wren retreat further into herself, into that journal, into the silence she wore like armor. Instead, she said, "What are you thinking about?" Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was trying to remember the last time we had ice cream." Cora's chest tightened. "Your birthday," she said softly. 3 years ago. That little shop on Main Street with the blue awning. You got strawberry with rainbow sprinkles. I don't remember what it tasted like anymore." Wren's voice was distant, almost wondering. "I just remember Dad laughing about something. I don't even remember what was funny. Just that he was laughing, and you were laughing too, and everything felt safe." The light turned green. Cora drove forward, blinking hard against the burn behind her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. Wren turned to look at her. "For what?" "For this." The words came out cracked and raw, spilling out before she could stop them. "For all of it. For every parking lot. Every night in that car. Every time I said I wasn't hungry so you could have more. For making your whole life smaller because mine fell apart." Wren was quiet long enough for the silence to hurt. Then she said, "Mom, you didn't make my life smaller." Cora laughed once, broken and humorless. "Didn't I?" "No." Wren's voice was steady, certain, older than it should have been. "Life did that. The accident, the bills, the bank. You didn't do any of that." She paused. "You're the reason it didn't disappear completely. You're the reason I'm still here." The words hit harder than pity ever could. Cora looked back at the road because she could not bear to cry and drive at the same time. Have you ever forgotten the taste of a happy memory? If you're listening right now and you understand what that feels like, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening from today? And if this story is speaking to something in your own life, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. The journey is just beginning. When the paved highway gave way to a narrow mountain road, the world changed. Pines thickened on both sides, pressing close to the road like sentinels standing watch. Shadows stretched longer, the afternoon light filtering through branches in dusty golden beams that seemed to point the way forward. The GPS signal flickered in and out like it was trying to abandon them too, the robotic voice cutting out mid-sentence before falling silent entirely. Cora drove by instinct after that, following the handwritten directions Aldous had given her on a sheet of legal paper. Left at the Crooked Oak, right where the creek crosses under the road. Straight until you see the clearing. The air grew cooler as they climbed higher into the mountains, crisper, carrying the scent of pine sap and wood smoke, and something older beneath it all. Earth, stone, time itself, moving slower up here where the world had not yet caught up with itself. By the time they turned onto a dirt path barely wide enough for the car, the late afternoon sunlight had thinned to gold, slanting through the trees like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Then she saw it. The cabin stood in a clearing, like something the world had forgotten on purpose. The roof sagged in the middle, bowing under the weight of too many winters and too little care. One shutter hung crooked from a single rusted hinge, creaking softly in the wind, like a voice trying to remember how to speak. The porch steps listed sideways into a tangle of weeds and wildflowers that had grown up through the rotting wood, purple asters and yellow goldenrod, pushing through gaps like stubborn hope refusing to die even when everything around it had given up. Half the windows were clouded with decades of grime, turning whatever light remained into something gray and uncertain. The rest looked black, as though the inside had swallowed all light and refused to give it back. The logs were split and weather-beaten, silvered by age and neglect. The chinking between them crumbled away in patches that let the wind whistle through. Cora stopped the car and just stared. "This is it?" she whispered. Wren unfolded the paper with the address, checked the faded numbers nailed to a post near the path, then nodded slowly. "This is it." For one long moment, neither of them moved. Cora felt anger rise first, hot and sharp, burning behind her ribs like something trying to claw its way out. Then shame. Shame for still being capable of disappointment after everything life had already done to her. Shame for having hoped, even for a moment, that something might finally go right. Then beneath the anger and the shame, something else. Something smaller, quieter. Curiosity. Why had a woman she had never met chosen her to inherit this place? Why the strange note about knowing the price of a roof? Why the instruction not to sell, not to leave, to listen to the house? "It's worse than I imagined," she said. Wren opened her door. Wren. But her daughter was already stepping out onto the dirt, her worn sneakers crunching on pine needles and gravel. Her eyes were fixed on the cabin, studying it the way she studied everything these days, like she was trying to read something written beneath the surface, something invisible to anyone who was not looking hard enough. Cora followed more slowly, her legs heavy, her joints stiff from 4 hours of driving. The evening air was cool against her skin, carrying the smell of pine sap and damp earth and something older. Memory, maybe, or the particular scent of a place that had been waiting a very long time for someone to arrive. On the porch, a board groaned under Wren's weight. She placed one hand against the old wood of the doorframe and stood there listening. The wind moved through the trees behind them with a lonely whispering sound. Cora wrapped her arms around herself against the chill. "We can still leave. Find a motel somewhere. Come back in the morning when it's light." Wren kept her hand on the cabin. "It's ugly," she said. "That's generous." Wren turned and looked at her mother, tired and serious and older than any 16-year-old should have been. "But it's ours." The words hung in the air between them like something solid. Then Cora saw it. Movement on the porch, near the corner where the shadows gathered thickest. She tensed, reaching instinctively for Wren's arm, pulling her daughter back a step. But it was not a threat. It was a dog. An old dog lying against the cabin wall with its head resting on its paws. Its fur was the color of pale honey gone dull with age and neglect, matted in places, thin over the ribs that showed too clearly through its coat. One ear was torn, and its eyes had the clouded look of an animal that had been waiting for something for a very long time. But when it saw them, its tail moved, just once. A weak, hopeful thump against the porch boards. Wren crouched down slowly, extending her hand palm up, unthreatening. "Hey there," she whispered. "Hey, sweet thing. It's okay. It's okay." The dog lifted its head with effort. Its nose twitched, scenting her. Then, with what seemed like enormous effort, it dragged itself closer and pressed its muzzle into Ren's palm. There was a collar around its neck, faded leather, cracked with age. A small metal tag hung from it, tarnished but legible. Biscuit. Biscuit, Wren repeated softly, running her fingers through the matted fur. She looked up at her mother, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. Mom, this was Opal's dog. She left him behind. Cora stared at the animal, at its thin frame and tired eyes and the way it leaned into Wren's touch like it had been starving for kindness, even more than food. Something cracked inside her chest. A wall she had built to keep herself functioning, to keep moving forward, to keep pretending she was strong enough to carry this weight. She didn't leave him behind, Cora said quietly. She died, and he waited. Wren stroked the dog's head with gentle fingers. He's still waiting. For what? Wren looked at the cabin, then back at her mother, and her voice was very soft when she answered. For someone to come back. They were still standing on the porch when a voice cut through the evening air. You the ones who inherited this place? Cora spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards away, half hidden in the shadow of the pines. She was older, perhaps 70 or more, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight braid, and a face that looked like it had been carved by decades of mountain weather. All sharp angles and deep lines, the kind of face that came from sun and wind and hard living and refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. She wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up over wiry forearms, mud-stained boots that had seen better decades, and an expression that suggested she had strong opinions about strangers and was not shy about sharing them. And she was holding a shotgun, not aimed at them, not exactly, but not pointed away either, held loose at her side, casual and ready, the way someone held a tool they knew how to use without having to think about it. Cora stepped in front of Wren instinctively, putting herself between her daughter and the gun. Who's asking? Name's Mabel Thornton. I live about half a mile that way. She jerked her chin toward the trees to the east. Been keeping an eye on this place since Opal passed, making sure nobody came to strip it for parts or burn it down for the insurance money that don't exist anyway. Cora kept her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. We're not here to strip anything. This is my inheritance. Mabel's eyes narrowed. She studied Cora for a long moment, her gaze moving slowly, assessing, taking in the worn clothes, the exhausted posture, the old car in the clearing with its trunk full of blankets and desperation. Then she looked at Wren, crouched on the porch with her arms wrapped protectively around the old dog. Inheritance, she repeated, like the word tasted sour in her mouth. Opal's people aren't known for their goodness, you know. The ones who came before, they picked this family apart like vultures on a carcass, sold everything that wasn't nailed down and tried to sell what was, fought each other in courts for decades over scraps while the real treasure rotted away untouched. I'm not them. That's what they all say. Cora took a breath, fighting to keep her voice even. Ma'am, I don't know what the Harrington family did or didn't do. I never met Opal. I didn't even know she existed until this morning when a lawyer called me. All I know is that I've been sleeping in a car with my daughter for 11 months, and this cabin, falling apart as it is the first thing anyone has given us that we didn't have to beg for. Mabel's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or memory. Sleeping in a car, she said. Yes. How long? 11 months. Just the two of you? Just us. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind in the pines and the sound of Biscuit's tail thumping weakly against the porch as Wren continued to stroke his head. Then Mabel lowered the shotgun. Well, she said slowly, maybe that's why Opal picked you. Before Cora could ask what she meant, Mabel turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows like she had never been there at all. Wren looked up from where she was still kneeling with the dog. That was weird. Yes, Cora agreed. It was. But as she watched the trees where Mabel had vanished, she could not shake the feeling that the old woman knew something. Something important. Something Cora was only beginning to glimpse. That night, Cora and Wren worked by lantern light to make the cabin livable enough to sleep in. They found an old oil lamp in a cabinet near the stove, its glass chimney cracked but intact, still half full of kerosene that smelled of dust and decades. Wren got it lit while Cora cleared debris from the massive stone hearth that dominated one wall of the front room. The fireplace was built from riverstone, each piece fitted carefully into place by hands that had been dead for a century or more. The stones were blackened by decades of use, but solid, enduring. Cora remembered what Hollis had taught her about wood stoves and chimney drafts during their first winter in the little house they had bought together, back when learning such things had seemed like an adventure rather than a necessity for survival. She checked the flue, found it stuck with years of creosote and debris, and used a rusted poker to force it open. Soot rained down into the hearth in a black cascade, making them both cough and wave their hands in front of their faces. But when she lit a small fire with dry twigs and crumpled newspaper from a stack near the door, the smoke rose properly, drawn up and away into the night sky. Small victories. That was what survival was made of. Small victories strung together like beads on a thread. They swept the floors with a broom that was missing half its bristles. They shook out old curtains that released so much dust they both coughed and laughed and coughed again, the sounds strange and almost foreign in the empty cabin. They dragged the least rotted mattress from the back bedroom and beat it with a stick until it stopped smelling quite so much like mildew and neglect. Biscuit followed Wren everywhere, his tail wagging weakly whenever she spoke to him. She found a dented tin bowl in the kitchen and filled it with water from a hand pump outside that still worked, though it groaned and squealed like it was protesting being woken from a long sleep. "Poor thing's half starved," Wren said, watching the dog drink. Cora opened one of their precious cans of soup, the last of the chicken noodle, and poured half of it into a cracked dish she found on a shelf. She set it on the floor near the stove. Biscuit looked at it, then at her, then back at the food like he could not quite believe it was real. Then he ate like he had forgotten food existed. By the time full dark had fallen, the cabin looked different. Not good, not safe, but claimed. "It doesn't feel as bad now," Wren said, standing in the middle of the front room with her arms wrapped around herself. "No," Cora admitted, looking around at the flickering shadows cast by the fire. "It doesn't." For the first time in 11 months, they had walls around them, a roof overhead, even if it sagged, a door that locked from the inside. It was not much, but it was more than they had yesterday. Cora did not sleep well that night. She lay on a pile of blankets near the fireplace, watching the flames die down to embers, listening to the cabin breathe around her. That was the only way she could describe it. The old place did not sit in silence. It creaked and whispered and settled into itself with the tired sounds of wood that had survived too many winters alone. Wren had fallen asleep on the mattress in the corner. Biscuit curled against her side like he had found the person he had been waiting for all along. The dog had not left her since they arrived. He lay with his head on her arm, his clouded eyes half open, watching the shadows like he was waiting for something. Cora was almost asleep, drifting in that gray space between consciousness and dreams, when she heard it, a sound from below. Not a creak, not the settling of old boards. A knock, dull, hollow, rhythmic, like someone tapping on wood from underneath the floor. She sat up fast, her heart slamming against her ribs. Biscuit lifted his head, his ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat, soft but unmistakable. Wren stirred in the darkness. "Mom?" "Shh." Cora held up a hand. "Did you hear that?" They both listened, barely breathing. Silence. Then it came again. 3 slow knocks, muffled and distant, coming from somewhere beneath the floor near the fireplace. Wren's eyes went wide in the dying firelight. "That's not the house settling," she whispered. "No," Cora agreed, her voice barely audible. "It's not." They did not sleep after that. Cora sat with her back against the wall, watching the fire die to ash, listening for any sound that did not belong. Biscuit stayed alert beside Wren, his ears twitching at every creak and groan. When dawn finally came, pale gray light seeping through the dirty windows, Cora rose with stiff joints and gritty eyes. "We should look," Wren said. Cora turned to find her daughter already crouched near the hearth, running her hands along the floorboards like she was reading something written in the grain of the wood. "Wren! Mom, we heard something. We both heard it." Wren pressed her palm flat against the floor, listening. What if there's a crawl space, a cellar, something underneath? What if there's a gas leak or a nest of snakes? Wren gave her a look that was equal parts patience and determination. The same look Hollis used to give her when she was being overly cautious about something. Then we'll know. But we won't know anything if we don't look. Cora wanted to argue, wanted to be the kind of mother who could still say no and be obeyed. But Wren was right. And more than that, Cora needed to know. Opal's note had said to listen to the house. Maybe this was what the house was trying to say. They searched the floor systematically, moving on hands and knees, knocking on boards, listening for differences in tone. Most of the wood answered with a solid thud, old and warped, but thick. Then Wren knocked near the fireplace, close to where the stones met the floor. The sound came back hollow. She looked up at her mother. Here. Cora knelt beside her. The boards in front of the hearth were darker than the others, worn smooth by decades of feet. One nail sat slightly crooked. Another board had the faintest split along its edge, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Wren found the butter knife they had used to spread peanut butter the night before and wedged it into the crack. Careful, Cora said. I am. The board resisted. Wren pressed harder, leaning her weight into it, her face tight with effort. Something gave. A crack. A groan of old wood releasing its grip on secrets it had held for decades. Then the plank lifted. Dust rose into the air in a cloud that caught the early morning light streaming through the windows. Biscuit barked once, sharp and startled, backing away with his tail between his legs. Beneath the board was darkness. A narrow space, perhaps 18 inches deep, running between the cabin floor and the earth below. It was lined with flat stones, deliberately placed. Not a crawl space. Something intentional. Something built by human hands with a specific purpose in mind. And there, tucked between two beams, sat a small metal box. Cora's breath stopped in her chest. Mom, Wren whispered. Do you see that? I see it. Wren reached down without hesitation. Wait, but her daughter had already pulled it free. The box was no bigger than a loaf of bread, tin or steel, rusted at the edges but still intact. It had a hinged lid and a small clasp, tarnished green with age. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. They set it on the floor between them. Neither spoke. Then Wren lifted the clasp. The hinge resisted, frozen by decades of disuse. Wren pressed harder. Metal scraped against metal with a sound like a whispered complaint. Then it opened with a dry, groaning sound. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper tied with faded blue ribbon, an old iron key black with age, 3 gold coins that gleamed even through decades of tarnish, and a small cloth pouch that clinked softly when Wren lifted it. Cora stared at the coins. Even in the thin morning light, they looked heavy, old, real. Not the kind of coins you found in stores or received as change. These were something else entirely, something from another time. But it was the paper that drew her hand. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the page with trembling fingers. The handwriting was the same as the note from the lawyer's office. Thin, careful, old-fashioned. If you are reading this, then the cabin has not chosen a fool. Cora's breath caught in her throat. What is hidden here was never meant for the greedy, only for the one who understands what shelter is worth before asking what gold is worth. She kept reading, her heart beating faster with every line. My sons betrayed me. They forged my signature when I was too weak to fight. They threatened to have me declared incompetent so they could seize what remained of our family's land. They would have stripped these mountains bare and sold them for pennies on the dollar to developers who saw only profit where I saw home. I could not let them, so I hid what remained. And I have waited across the years for someone worthy to find it. This box is only proof that you have found the beginning. There is more, much more. Hidden where greedy hands could not think to look. Begin where the fire once fed the house. Below the letter was a signature, the ink faded but still legible. Ezra Harrington, March 1923. Do you believe there are secrets hidden beneath the floors of old houses? Things buried and waiting across generations for the right person to find them? If you've ever discovered something unexpected in an old building, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to find out what else is hidden in that cabin, keep listening. This is where the story really begins. Cora set the letter down slowly, Her hands were shaking. 1923, Wren said. That's over 100 years ago. Yes. And he hid this. For someone to find. Yes. Wren looked at the coins, then at the key, then at her mother. Begin where the fire once fed the house, she said slowly, turning the phrase over like she was testing its weight. The fireplace? Cora looked at the massive stone hearth. Then her eyes moved across the room to the other source of heat. The black iron stove in the corner. It sat squat and heavy on a square of stone, darker than the floor around it. Everything else in the cabin had been left to sag and rot and surrender to time. The porch was collapsing. The shutters were falling off. The roof leaked in 3 places they had already discovered. But the stove looked solid, deliberate, too carefully anchored to be ordinary. Not the fireplace, Cora said slowly, understanding dawning. The stove. Fire fed the house from the stove, heated it, kept it alive through winters. Wren's eyes widened. We need to move it. They were still examining the stove, trying to understand how it was fastened to the floor, when the sound of an engine cut through the mountain silence. Cora straightened fast, her heart suddenly pounding. Through the grimy window, she saw a black Mercedes SUV pulling into the clearing, its chrome gleaming like it had never known a dirt road before today. A man stepped out. He was perhaps 58 or 60, with silver hair swept back from a tanned face and a camel-colored overcoat that looked like it cost more than everything Cora owned combined, car included. His boots were expensive leather, spotless despite the mud. His smile, when it appeared, had the practiced warmth of someone who had learned long ago that charm was cheaper than honesty and considerably more useful. He carried a bouquet of flowers, white lilies, funeral flowers. Biscuit growled low in his throat, the sound rumbling through the cabin like a warning. Cora met the stranger on the porch, positioning herself between him and the cabin door, her body blocking any view of what lay inside. Mrs. Beckett, he asked. Who's asking? Garrison Calloway. He extended a hand, his smile widening to show teeth that were very white and very even. I own several properties in this county. I was a friend of Opal's for many years. When I heard her cabin had finally found a new owner, I thought I'd come pay my respects and introduce myself. Cora did not take his hand. That's a long drive for an introduction. Something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation, but his smile held. I admire direct people, he said, withdrawing his hand and tucking it casually into his coat pocket. May I come in? No. He gave a small, amused nod, as though she had passed some kind of test, and he was gracious enough to acknowledge it. Then I'll be direct as well. That cabin is more trouble than it's worth, Mrs. Beckett. Structural damage that would cost more to fix than the place is worth. Title complications that could take years to untangle. No modern utilities and no realistic way to install them without spending a fortune. The county has been threatening to condemn it for years. He paused, letting the words sink in. I'd be willing to relieve you of the burden. Relieve me. With cash. He reached into his coat and produced a thick envelope, holding it up where she could see it. $25,000 today, right now. You could walk away from this mess and start fresh somewhere warm, somewhere with running water and a roof that doesn't leak. Somewhere you and your daughter could build a real life instead of camping in the ruins of someone else's. Cora stared at the envelope. $25,000. More money than she had seen in one place in years. Enough to rent an apartment with actual bedrooms. Buy groceries for months without counting every penny. Get Wren into a stable school, a stable life. It was the answer to every desperate prayer she had whispered in church parking lots at 3 a.m. when the cold crept through the car windows and she wondered how much longer they could survive. And that was exactly why it terrified her. A $50 cabin, a stranger with cash, an offer that made no sense unless he knew something she did not. That's generous, she said carefully, keeping her voice neutral, for a place you just described as worthless. Garrison's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. Worthless properties sometimes sit on useful land. Future development, access roads, timber rights. I like to buy ugly things before other people learn how to see their potential. Wren appeared in the doorway behind her mother, Biscuit pressed against her legs. You came awful fast, she said, for somebody who just heard about the sale. Garrison's gaze shifted to her. He studied her for a moment, assessed her youth and her shabby clothes and her skinny frame, and then dismissed her with the easy confidence of a man who did not consider teenage girls worth taking seriously. That was a mistake. News travels in small counties, he said smoothly. From lawyers? From everyone. Cora watched his face. Watched the impatience flickering beneath the polish, like a fire someone was trying to smother. He was working too hard to sound casual, trying too hard to seem helpful. Something was wrong with this picture. Something he was not telling them. You said there were title problems, Cora said. There can be with old family properties. And yet you came with $25,000 in cash anyway. He smiled again, but the warmth had leaked out of it like heat from a poorly sealed window. That's what confidence looks like, Mrs. Beckett. No, Cora said quietly. That's what urgency looks like. Silence stretched between them. The wind moved through the pines. A bird called somewhere in the distance. Biscuit's growl deepened to something that was almost a snarl. Garrison's expression shifted. The charm dropped away like a mask he was tired of wearing, replaced by something harder, colder, more real. Mrs. Beckett, he said, his voice lower now, let me offer you some practical advice. People in difficult positions sometimes mistake stubbornness for strength. This cabin is not a blessing. It's a trap. Take the money. Start over somewhere else. You don't want to become part of this family's history. Is that a threat? It's a kindness. He tucked the envelope back into his coat. One I won't offer again. He turned to leave, but paused at the edge of the porch. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, almost bitter. Opal refused me too, many times over the years. She said I reminded her too much of my father. He glanced back over his shoulder, meeting Cora's eyes. My father was one of Ezra Harrington's grandsons, one of the ones who was cut out of the inheritance. The ones who spent their whole lives being called thieves and traitors because a paranoid old man hid his fortune instead of sharing it with his own blood. Cora's stomach dropped. I'm not a villain, Mrs. Beckett. I'm just a man who wants what should have belonged to my family 3 generations ago. Whatever Opal hid in there, whatever Ezra left behind, it doesn't belong to strangers. It belongs to the Harrington bloodline. He held her gaze for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. We'll speak again. Then he walked to his Mercedes, climbed in, and drove away without looking back. Cora locked the door that night. Not that it would matter if Garrison Calloway decided he wanted to get in. A man with that much money and that much certainty did not let locked doors stop him. But the gesture made her feel less exposed. Wren sat at the table, the old letters spread before her in the lamplight, Biscuit asleep at her feet. He knows, she said quietly. Cora nodded, sitting down across from her daughter. He knows something, maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to come with $25,000 in his pocket. Yes. Wren traced her finger along the edge of Ezra's letter, her brow furrowed in thought. His family spent 3 generations believing they were cheated. What if there's really more to find? Cora sat down across from her daughter and took her hand. Then we find it first. And if we don't? Cora squeezed her fingers. Then we figure out what it means. But I'm not giving this cabin to a man who shows up with funeral flowers and cash on the same day. Not until I understand what Opal wanted me to find. The storm came 3 nights later. It was not supposed to arrive until the weekend. The old radio Cora had found in a kitchen drawer crackled with weather reports that promised clear skies, mild temperatures, an easy transition into early winter. But the mountains made their own weather, following rules the forecasters in their distant studios could not predict. Cora woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of wind howling against the cabin walls like something hungry trying to get in. She sat up fast, heart pounding, and saw through the window a wall of white. Snow, thick and relentless, driving sideways in the wind, already piling against the porch steps in drifts that glowed faintly in the darkness. By morning, they could not open the front door. The snow had piled waist-high against it overnight, sealing them inside. They were trapped. For 3 days, the storm raged. Cora rationed the firewood they had gathered, feeding the stove just enough to keep the cabin above freezing. Their breath fogged in the air, even near the fire, and ice formed on the inside of the windows in intricate patterns of frost that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Wren melted snow for drinking water, hauling buckets from the back window to the stove and back again until her arms ached. Biscuit stayed pressed against them both, His old body a small furnace of warmth, refusing to leave their sides even when the wind screamed against the walls and the whole cabin shuddered. They ate the last of the peanut butter on the second day, scraping the jar clean with their fingers and not wasting a drop. The last of the bread on the third morning, hard and stale but filling. When the soup ran out, they had nothing left but determination. "We're going to be okay," Cora kept saying, though she was not sure she believed it. "The storm will break. It has to break." Wren huddled under every blanket they owned near the stove, writing in her journal by candlelight, not complaining, even though Cora knew she must be as scared and hungry as her mother was. "Mom," Wren said on the second night, her voice small in the darkness, "tell me about Dad." So Cora did. She talked about how they met at a county fair when she was 19 and he was 21, both of them reaching for the same caramel apple at a concession stand. How he had smiled and let her have it, then followed her around for the rest of the evening until she agreed to give him her phone number just to get some peace. She talked about their wedding, small and simple, in the backyard of his parents' house with folding chairs borrowed from the church, and a borrowed stereo playing their first dance song, while his mother cried and her best friend took blurry photos. She talked about the night Wren was born, how Hollis had cried harder than either of them, how he had held his daughter like she was made of glass, and whispered promises into her tiny ears that Cora could not quite hear, but knew were important. She talked until her voice gave out, and then she held Wren while the storm raged outside, and they slept that way, tangled together for warmth, with an old dog watching over them both. On the morning of the fourth day, Cora woke to silence. The wind had stopped. She struggled out of the pile of blankets and stumbled to the window on legs that felt weak from cold and hunger. The world outside was white, completely, absolutely white. 2 feet of fresh snow blanketed the clearing, the trees, the road. Everything was buried, everything was still, everything was transformed into something new and strange and beautiful. The sun had broken through the clouds, turning the snow into a field of diamonds that hurt to look at. They had survived, barely, but they had survived. Mabel Thornton appeared at noon, trudging through the snow with a pack on her back and snowshoes on her feet. "Figured you might be running low," she said, handing Cora a canvas bag filled with canned soup, dried beans, a jar of golden honey, and a loaf of bread that was still slightly warm. Cora took it with numb fingers, tears welling in her eyes before she could stop them. "Thank you. You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to." Mabel stepped past her into the cabin, stamping snow from her boots and looking around with sharp, assessing eyes. "I wanted to." She stayed for 3 hours. They ate soup heated over the stove and drank weak tea made from herbs Mabel had dried herself the previous summer. The warmth spread through Cora's body like medicine, thawing something that had been frozen for longer than just 3 days. And somewhere between the eating and the warming, Mabel began to talk about Opal. "I knew her for 40 years, Mabel said, her voice rough with memory and age. "She moved up here after her husband left, just walked out one day, took the truck and half the savings, and vanished like he'd never existed. No note, no explanation, no forwarding address, nothing but empty hangers in the closet and a wedding ring left on the kitchen table. She had a son, about 10 years old at the time, had to raise him alone up here in these mountains." Wren stroked Biscuit's ears, her eyes fixed on Mabel's face. "What happened to the son?" "Grew up angry, like boys do when their fathers abandon them. Married young, left younger, moved to California or Arizona or somewhere like that, chasing something he never found. Never called, never wrote. Not even at Christmas. Not even when she got sick." Mabel stared into her tea like she could see the past reflected in it. "Opal lived alone after that. Just her and this old dog. For 30 years. That's so sad," Wren said softly. "It was. But she wasn't bitter about it. Not the way you'd expect. Not the way she had every right to be." Mabel looked up, meeting Cora's eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "She used to say she was waiting for something. Never told me what. But she'd sit on that porch for hours, summer and winter both, watching the road like she knew someone was coming." Cora thought about the letter, the note in the lawyer's office, the strange message that had brought her here, to the one who knows the price of a roof before asking the value of gold. "She knew," Cora said softly, the understanding settling into her like something that had always been true. She knew whoever came would understand what it felt like to lose everything. Mabel studied her for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. Maybe she did, she said finally. Maybe she saw something in you that even you don't see yet. After Mabel left, Cora and Wren turned their attention to the stove. The fourth bolt, the newer one that looked different from the others, came loose with effort. Then the third, the second. By the time they removed the last one, both of them were sweating despite the lingering cold in the cabin. Together they pushed. The stove scraped across the stone floor with a grinding howl that echoed through the cabin, the sound of something that had not moved in decades finally yielding to human hands. Beneath it, set into the stone foundation, was an iron ring. Wren looked at her mother, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Cora nodded. Wren pulled. The hidden panel rose with a groan of ancient hinges, releasing a breath of cold, stale air from below that smelled of earth and stone and time. A shaft, narrow and dark, opened beneath the stove, stone-lined, deliberately constructed. Not deep enough to be a full cellar, but deeper than a crawl space, a hiding place built by someone who knew what they were doing. And there at the bottom, gleaming faintly in the lantern light they held over the opening, sat a steel strongbox and a leather document case wrapped in oilcloth. Cora's hand trembled so badly she nearly dropped the lantern. "Mom," Wren whispered, her voice catching. "Mom, do you see that?" "I see it. I'm going down." "No, Mom." Wren's voice was firm in a way it had never been before. "You can't fit. I can." She met her mother's eyes with a steadiness that seemed to belong to someone much older. "You've protected me for 11 months. Let me help now." Cora wanted to refuse. Every instinct in her body screamed to keep her daughter safe, to not let her descend into that dark hole in the earth where anything could be waiting. But Wren was right. And sometimes the hardest part of being a mother was learning to let go. "Be careful," Cora whispered, her voice thick. "Please be careful." "I will." Wren lowered herself into the shaft, her feet finding narrow footholds in the ancient stone. She reached the bottom, lifted the strong box with visible effort, straining against its weight, and passed it up to her mother. Then the document case, lighter but somehow more precious. Then herself, climbing back into the light with dirt on her hands and wonder in her eyes. They sat on the cabin floor with their discoveries between them, breathing hard, hearts pounding in the silence. The document case held papers, dozens of them, deeds written in faded ink on thick paper that crackled when touched. Survey maps with boundaries marked in pencil, mineral rights, timber claims, transfer records dating back to the 1890s, before anyone alive today had been born. And beneath them, wrapped in wax paper that had kept them pristine for a century, a packet of bearer bonds with printed values so large Cora had to read them 3 times to believe what she was seeing. The strongbox held gold, coins that caught the light and threw it back in gleaming arcs, small bars no bigger than her thumb, stamped with numbers and dates, a velvet pouch of jewelry that clinked when Wren lifted it, diamond brooches that sparkled even through decades of darkness, a sapphire ring that caught the light like frozen fire, a woman's wedding band engraved with initials that matched the name on the oldest deed, and beneath everything, one final envelope. Cora opened it with hands that would not stop shaking. If this is in your hands, then mercy arrived before greed. My sons would have sold these mountains for pennies on the dollar. They would have stripped the timber until the hills were bare, poisoned the streams with mining runoff, sold the mineral rights to companies that would have torn the earth apart and walked away when nothing was left. I watched them at my own table, speaking of these hills as numbers, not as shelter. They valued acreage more than blood, profit more than heritage. So I hid what remained. I hid it from my own children because my own children had become strangers to me. I hid it for whoever came after them with need instead of appetite. The bonds and claims properly registered should exceed $5 million in value, perhaps more, with time and proper management. But if you think the money is the inheritance, you have understood nothing. The true inheritance is not wealth. It is the right to turn shelter into safety for someone who comes after you. Ezra Harrington. Cora set the letter down slowly. Wren stared at the bonds, then at the gold, then at her mother, her face pale in the lamplight. $5 million, she whispered. Yes, Mom. Her voice broke on the word, cracking open to let out something she had been holding inside for months. "Mom!" Cora pulled her daughter into her arms, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, from something else entirely. Relief. Wild, terrifying, almost painful relief. They sat there on the floor of that old cabin, holding each other, tears streaming down both their faces, while the winter sun streamed through the windows, and the old dog watched from his spot near the wall. They had found it. But even as the first wave of joy broke over them, another truth followed close behind like a shadow. If Garrison Calloway had guessed there was something hidden here, he would not stop coming. And now they had something worth fighting for. Have you ever seen people suddenly remember their family when money's involved? If you have a story like that, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And if you want to know how Cora faces what's coming next, keep listening. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones we fight against strangers, but the ones we fight against people who believe they're owed what we have. Garrison Calloway filed his lawsuit within a week. How he learned what they had found, Cora never discovered. Perhaps a clerk at the county records office who noticed the unusual documents being registered. Perhaps someone at the bank, where Aldous had begun the verification process. Perhaps simply the weight of that much money moving through a small community where everyone watched everyone else and secrets had short lifespans. The summons arrived on a gray morning in December, delivered by a young deputy who apologized twice before handing over the papers, his eyes full of something that might have been sympathy. Cora read it standing in the doorway, her breath fogging in the cold air. Calloway versus Beckett. Regarding the contested estate of Ezra Harrington and the fraudulent transfer of concealed assets. Behind the legal language was a simple claim. The hidden wealth belonged to all of Ezra's descendants, not just the stranger who happened to inherit the cabin. The Calloway family, along with other Harrington heirs, demanded restitution, justice, their rightful share of what had been kept from them. 3 other names appeared on the suit, distant cousins. Harrington's Cora had never heard of. People who had not spoken to Opal in decades, who had not attended her funeral, who had probably not thought about her at all until word spread about what lay hidden beneath her cabin floor. They came out of the woodwork like termites smelling fresh wood. "What do we do?" Wren asked, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her fear. Cora folded the summons carefully along its creases. "We fight." Aldous Pemberton had planned to retire at the end of the year. His office was mostly packed now, the boxes sealed and labeled, the certificates and diplomas wrapped in newspaper, a lifetime of legal work being slowly dismantled in preparation for whatever came next. But when Cora showed him the summons, he sat down heavily behind his half-empty desk and did not speak for a long time. "I should tell you to find someone else," he finally said. "Someone younger, someone with more resources for a fight like this. A big Nashville firm with investigators and research assistants and a war chest for extended litigation." But he looked up at her with tired, kind eyes that had seen too many cases and too much injustice. "But I've spent 40 years helping rich people stay rich, helping banks foreclose on families, helping corporations bury inconvenient truths in paperwork thick enough to smother the truth." He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Just once, before I'm done, I'd like to help someone who actually deserves it." He took the case. Pro bono. The hearing was held in the county courthouse 6 weeks later, a small brick building with creaking floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew. A portrait of Abraham Lincoln hung slightly crooked on the wall behind the judge's bench. Watching the proceedings with patient, knowing eyes that seemed to see everything. Cora wore the same blue blouse she had worn to Aldis's office nearly 5 months earlier. It was still the nicest thing she owned. Wren sat beside her in the gallery, Biscuit at her feet. The bailiff had tried to object to the dog's presence, but Aldous had produced a letter from a doctor in Maryville declaring him an emotional support animal, and the matter was settled. Garrison Calloway sat at the opposing table with a lawyer from Nashville in a suit that cost more than everything Cora owned combined. His hair was perfectly styled, his expression calm, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and had rarely been disappointed. The 3 distant cousins sat behind him in the gallery, whispering among themselves like conspirators, occasionally shooting hostile glances across the aisle. The judge was a woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened without interrupting as both sides presented their arguments, her face giving nothing away. The Nashville lawyer spoke first. He was polished and precise, his words carefully chosen, painting a picture of Cora as an opportunist who stumbled onto a fortune she had no right to claim. He described the hidden cash as misappropriated family assets that Ezra had wrongfully concealed from his legitimate heirs. He suggested that Opal Harrington had been isolated and mentally declining in her final years, and that her decision to leave the cabin to a stranger should be viewed with appropriate skepticism. He talked for 45 minutes, his voice rising and falling with practiced drama. When he was finished, he looked satisfied, confident, like a man who had already counted his victory. Then Aldous rose. He was old and tired and did not cut an impressive figure against the Nashville lawyer's polish. His suit was 20 years out of fashion. His hair needed cutting. He had to pause twice to catch his breath before he began speaking, but his voice was steady. Your Honor, my colleague speaks eloquently of rightful heirs and legitimate claims. He paints a picture of a confused old woman manipulated by a stranger. Aldous picked up a worn leather journal from the table, holding it up so everyone could see. I would like to paint a different picture, a true picture. He held up the journal. This is Ezra Harrington's personal diary, written between 1920 and 1923, found in the same hidden cache as the bonds and the gold. In it, he describes in detail what his sons did to him in the winter of 1922. He opened the journal to a marked page and began to read, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. December 14th. Edmund came today with papers for me to sign. He said if I did not sign over the eastern parcel, he would have Dr. Morrison declare me incompetent and have me committed to the state hospital. He has already been to see the doctor. They have made arrangements behind my back. I saw it in his eyes when he spoke to me, the same eyes his mother loved, now looking at me like I am already dead, and he is merely waiting for my body to catch up with the fact. The courtroom was absolutely still. December 18th. Vernon and James came with Edmund today. All three of my sons together, united against their own father. They brought a lawyer with them. They said I was confused, that I didn't know what I was saying, that I was not competent to manage my own affairs. They said if I loved my grandchildren, I would sign the papers and stop making trouble. Vernon put his hand on my shoulder like we were friends, like we were family. His hand was cold. His smile was colder. Aldous turned a page. January 3rd, 1923. I have hidden what remains. The bonds, the deeds, the gold their mother's mother left to her. They will not find it. They have taken everything else from me, piece by piece, but they will not take this. Someday, when greed has burned itself out of the Harrington name, someone worthy will find what I have left. Someone who knows what shelter means. Someone who has stood in the rain without a roof over their head. He closed the journal slowly, reverently. Edmund Harrington was Garrison Calloway's great-grandfather, the man who, according to this diary, forged his father's signature on multiple land transfers, who threatened to have his own father committed to an asylum, who, along with his brothers, spent years systematically stealing from a man too old and sick to fight back. Aldous set the journal down on the table. Ezra hid his remaining assets not because he was paranoid or senile or confused. He hid them because he was being robbed by his own children. He left instructions, written in his own hand, that the cabin should pass to someone outside the family, someone who would understand what it meant to need shelter, someone who had lost enough to truly value what remained. He turned to face the judge directly, his voice quiet but firm. Opal Harrington honored her ancestors' wishes. She waited her entire life to find the right person, and she chose Coraline Beckett. Not because Mrs. Beckett was rich or powerful or well-connected, but because Mrs. Beckett knew what it meant to have nothing. And that, Your Honor, is exactly what Ezra Harrington wanted. The judge called a 15-minute recess. When court resumed, she asked if Cora wished to make a statement before she reviewed the evidence. Cora had not prepared anything. She was not a lawyer. She did not know the right words or the proper forms or the legal phrases that opened and closed arguments. But she stood anyway. Her legs shook. Her voice wanted to break. But she spoke. Your Honor, I don't know how to talk like lawyers do. I don't have fancy words or legal arguments. I only know what I've lived through. She took a breath, steadying herself. When that cabin was cold and broken and worthless, no one wanted it. No Garrison Calloway came with flowers and cash. No cousins remembered they shared blood with Opal Harrington. Everyone forgot about her. Everyone forgot about that falling down cabin in the mountains where an old woman lived alone with a dog for 30 years. She paused, her voice gaining strength. But the minute the forest started speaking in money, suddenly everyone remembered. Suddenly there was family. Suddenly there was fairness. Suddenly there were principles that needed defending and wrongs that needed righting. Her voice grew stronger still, fueled by something she had been holding back for months. I spent 11 months sleeping in a car with my daughter. 11 months of watching her pretend she wasn't hungry so I wouldn't feel guilty. 11 months of being invisible to everyone we passed on the street. I know what it feels like to be worthless, to be forgotten, to feel like you've already disappeared and the world just hasn't noticed yet. She looked directly at Garrison Calloway, meeting his eyes without flinching. The people in this room fighting for a piece of that inheritance ignored that cabin when it looked like us. When it was rotting and unwanted and worthless, they only want it now that they think it can make them rich. She turned back to the judge, her voice quiet but clear. Ezra Harrington hid his fortune from his own family because his family had betrayed him. Opal Harrington spent her whole life protecting what he'd hidden, waiting for someone who would understand. She chose me, not because I deserved a fortune, but because she knew I would understand what it cost to keep that cabin standing all those years, to protect something precious from people who only see dollar signs. She sat down. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Garrison Calloway stared at the table in front of him. For the first time since the hearing began, he would not meet anyone's eyes. The ruling came 12 days later. Cora was standing on the cabin porch in the early morning light, watching Wren throw a stick for biscuit in the melting snow, when her phone rang. Aldis's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. "It's done," he said. "She ruled in your favor. The transfer chain is valid. The will stands. The challenges are dismissed." He paused and she could hear him breathing. "The estate is yours. All of it." Cora's knees buckled. She sat down hard on the porch steps, the phone pressed to her ear, unable to speak. Through the clearing she saw Wren look up at the sound, saw the question in her daughter's face. Cora nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. And then Wren was running across the yard and Biscuit was barking, and they were both crying and laughing at the same time, tangled together on the snowy porch of a cabin that had almost been forgotten by the world. Sometimes the people who fight against us are just victims of the stories they were told as children. A grandfather's bitterness passed down through generations, becoming truth just because it was repeated often enough. Believed just because believing it was easier than questioning. What do you think? Is that an excuse for the harm they cause? Or does it make it more tragic? Let me know in the comments. Garrison Calloway was waiting by his car when Cora left the courthouse after the final hearing. He did not approach her, did not threaten, did not make a scene. He simply stood there, hands in the pockets of his expensive coat, watching her walk past with eyes that had lost some of their certainty. "You won," he said quietly. Cora stopped but did not turn around. "Yes, my grandfather died believing Ezra cheated him. My father believed the same thing. I grew up hearing that story at every family gathering, every holiday dinner. The wronged Callaways, the fortune that should have been ours. The old man who chose spite over family." His voice was different now, softer, smaller, more human. "Maybe the story was wrong," he said. "Maybe we were the villains all along and just didn't know it." Cora turned to face him. He looked older than he had at the cabin that first day. The polish was still there, the expensive clothes and careful grooming. But something behind his eyes had cracked, and she could see through to something more vulnerable underneath. "Your grandfather made choices," she said. "Your father made choices. You made choices. Every generation decided to believe the story that made them feel like victims instead of looking harder at the truth." She paused, considering her words carefully. "But it doesn't have to end with the story you inherited. You can write a different one." She started to walk away, then stopped and looked back at him. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're evil. I think you're just someone who got lost in a lie that started before you were born. That's not an excuse, but it might be a place to start." Garrison said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, some of the rigid defensiveness draining away. Cora left him standing there and walked to her car, where Wren and Biscuit were waiting. She did not look back. 6 weeks after the ruling, Aldous called with a list of buyers. Developers who wanted the land for luxury vacation homes that would sell for millions. Investors who wanted the mineral rights for mining operations. Conservation groups who wanted to preserve the forest for future generations. Any one of them would pay enough to set Cora up for life. A house in a nice neighborhood with a yard and a driveway, and rooms she didn't have to share. College for Wren at any school she chose. Investments that would mean never worrying about money again. "You've earned it," Aldous said over the phone. "No one would blame you for taking the money and walking away from all of this." Cora stood at the window of the cabin, watching the winter sun set over the mountains in bands of gold and pink and purple. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need." That evening, Cora and Wren sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "You should sell," Wren said. Cora looked at her daughter in surprise. "What?" "You should sell the land, take the money, buy a nice house somewhere warm. You've been through enough. You deserve to rest. You deserve to stop fighting." Cora was quiet for a long moment, watching her breath fog in the cold air. "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" she finally said. "What?" "The women I met in the motel parking lots when we were looking for a room we could afford, the ones at the shelters when all the beds were full, the ones in the cars in the church lots at 3 in the morning, trying to quiet their babies so no one would call the police on them." She turned to face Wren, her expression serious. "They're still out there. Right now. Tonight. Mothers with children who don't know where they're going to sleep tomorrow. Women who've been told their whole lives that they're not worth saving." Wren pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Mom, I don't want to spend the rest of my life proving I escaped." Cora's voice was steady now, certain in a way it hadn't been for a long time. "I want what happened to us to mean something more than just our own survival." "What are you thinking?" Cora looked back at the cabin, at its patched roof and new windows, and the porch they had rebuilt together, board by board, through the long winter months. "I'm thinking about what Ezra wrote. The true inheritance is the right to turn shelter into safety for someone who comes after you." She reached over and took Wren's hand. "I want to keep the cabin. Not all the land, just enough. I want to make it a place where women who've lost everything can find their footing again. A place where being homeless doesn't mean being worthless. A place where someone can stand inside 4 walls that welcome them and remember what it feels like to be safe." Wren was quiet for a long time, looking out at the mountains. Then she squeezed her mother's hand. "You're sure?" "No." Cora smiled through the tears that were forming. "I'm not sure of anything, but I'm sure it feels right." "Then do it." Cora blinked. "What?" "I said do it." Wren leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "Do you remember what you used to tell me when I was little and I was scared about something? Before Dad died? Before everything fell apart? I told you a lot of things. You said being brave didn't mean not being scared. It meant being scared and doing the right thing anyway." Wren lifted her head and met her mother's eyes, and in that moment she looked so much like Hollis that Cora's heart ached with love and loss and pride all tangled together. "You've been scared for a long time, Mom. Scared of losing me. Scared of not being enough. Scared that everything was going to fall apart again." She smiled, and the smile transformed her face into something luminous. "Be brave anyway. I'll be right here." The sign went up in the spring. It was simple. Hand-carved from local wood by a craftsman in Creekstone who had heard their story and refused to accept any payment. Harrington House. A refuge for women and children. Because everyone deserves a door that locks from the inside. The first resident arrived in late April. Her name was Delphine. She was 66 years old with silver hair that had once been carefully styled and hands that shook when she tried to hold a cup of tea. Her son had convinced her to sign over her house 2 years earlier, promising to take care of her, to give her a room in his own home, to make sure she never wanted for anything. Instead, he had sold the property to pay gambling debts and disappeared to somewhere that didn't have extradition agreements. She had been sleeping in her car for 3 weeks when a social worker in Maryville gave her Cora's number. Delphine stood at the base of the porch steps, clutching a single worn suitcase that held everything she still owned, staring up at the cabin like it might disappear if she blinked. "I don't want charity," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never asked for charity in my life. I worked 40 years. I raised my children. I paid my taxes. I just need, I just need, She couldn't finish the sentence. The words caught in her throat and wouldn't come out. Cora walked down the steps and stood beside her in the spring sunshine. I know exactly what you need, she said gently, because I needed it too, not so long ago. Delphine looked at her, really looked, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or hope that she was afraid to feel. How do you know? She asked. How do you know I'm not, that I won't? I don't know anything for sure, Cora said honestly. I just know what it feels like to stand where you're standing, to wonder if anyone sees you anymore, to feel like you've already started to disappear. She held out her hand. I see you, Delphine. You're here. That's enough. Delphine stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment. Then she took it and walked inside. Wren graduated high school in a ceremony that Cora watched through tears she did not bother to hide. Afterward, they sat on the porch of the cabin eating cake that Mabel had baked, while Biscuit, older and grayer now, but still loyal, dozed in the afternoon sun. I got my acceptance letter, Wren said. Cora's heart stopped. What? When? Last week. Wren smiled, that real smile that had been so rare during the dark months and was becoming more common now. State University, architecture program. Architecture? I want to build things that stay standing. Wren looked at the cabin, at the repairs they had made together, at the walls that had sheltered them through the worst of it. Houses that don't fall apart when life gets hard, shelters that last. Cora pulled her daughter into a hug that felt like it might never end. Your father would be so proud of you, she whispered into Wren's hair. I know. Wren's voice was muffled against her shoulder. I think he is. Mabel Thornton became a permanent fixture at Harrington House. She came by 3 times a week, sometimes more, bringing vegetables from her garden and wisdom from her decades of mountain living. She taught the residents how to can tomatoes, how to mend clothes, how to stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy. She told stories about the old days in the mountains, about people who had survived worse than any of them and come out the other side stronger. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching Delphine teach another new resident how to use the wood stove, Mabel said something that Cora thought about for a long time afterward. You know why Opal really chose you? Cora shook her head. Because you showed up. Mabel's voice was matter of fact, but her eyes were soft with something that might have been affection. That's all. You showed up when everyone else had given up. You looked at something broken and saw something worth saving. She turned to meet Cora's gaze directly. That's the rarest thing in the world, you know. People who see value in what others have thrown away. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. It's been a journey, hasn't it? If Cora's story touched something in you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember this, wherever you are right now, whatever you're going through, your worth is not measured by what you own, or where you sleep, or how much money is in your account. It's measured by the kindness you show, especially to people who have nothing to offer you in return. Take care of yourselves, my friends, and if you're ever standing at the bottom of a staircase, looking up at a door you're afraid to knock on, remember that sometimes the door opens. Sometimes mercy finds us in the strangest places. Until next time. On the night before Wren left for college, Cora stood on the porch and looked up at the stars. The mountains rose dark against the sky, ancient and patient, keeping their own counsel the way they had for millions of years. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of late summer giving way to fall. Behind her, through the window, she could see Wren finishing her packing, Biscuit supervising from his spot on her bed, his tail wagging every time she talked to him. In her hand, Cora held Ezra Harrington's final letter. She had memorized every word by now, could recite it in her sleep, but she unfolded it anyway, letting the familiar phrases wash over her one more time in the starlight. The true inheritance is not wealth. It is the right to turn shelter into safety for someone who comes after you. She thought about everything that had led her here. The accident that took Hollis, the debts that took their home, the 11 months that took everything else. She thought about the phone call that changed it all, the drive up the mountain, the cabin that looked like a ruin and turned out to be a treasure. Not the gold and the bonds, though those had helped, the real treasure. The understanding that sometimes life doesn't break you. Sometimes it breaks you open. And what comes out of the breaking can be something stronger, something more beautiful than what was there before. Wren appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of tea that steamed in the cool night air. "Couldn't sleep," she said, handing one to her mother. "Me neither." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. "I'm going to miss this place," Wren said finally. "It'll be here when you come back." "I know, but still." She took a sip of tea, her eyes on the dark mountains. "It feels like leaving home, which is funny because for a long time I wasn't sure I'd ever feel like anywhere was home again." Cora put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Home isn't always a place," she said softly. "Sometimes it's people. Sometimes it's just knowing there's somewhere in the world where you belong." Wren leaned her head on her mother's shoulder the way she used to when she was small. "When did you get so wise?" "Suffering, mostly." Cora smiled into the darkness. "I don't recommend it as an educational method, but it is effective." Wren laughed and the sound drifted up into the night sky, mixing with the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. The next morning, Cora drove Wren to the bus station in Knoxville. They said goodbye on the platform, holding each other tight while other travelers flowed around them like water around stones. "Call me when you get there," Cora said, her voice thick. "I will. And eat actual food, not just ramen. I make no promises. And if you need anything, I know." Wren pulled back to look at her mother's face, memorizing it. "I know, you'll be there." Cora smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead, the way she had done when Wren was small and the world was simpler. "Always," she said, "no matter what." Wren smiled, and it was like watching the sun come out after a long storm. "I know." Then she picked up her bags and walked toward the bus, and Cora watched her go, feeling the familiar ache of letting go mixed with the unfamiliar warmth of watching someone you love fly toward their own future. At the bus door, Wren turned back and waved. Cora waved back, tears streaming down her face. And then her daughter was gone, off to build a life that Cora could only imagine, but would always support. That evening, Cora returned to Harrington House. Delphine met her at the door with a cup of tea already poured. "How are you doing?" she asked, her voice gentle. Cora thought about the question, really considered it instead of giving an automatic answer. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Sad but good. Happy, sad." "That's a real thing," Delphine said with a small smile. "I've felt it too." They walked together to the kitchen where Mabel was teaching a new resident, a young mother named Jolene, how to make biscuits from scratch. Jolene had arrived 3 days ago with a baby on her hip and bruises she was trying to hide beneath long sleeves. She hadn't smiled yet, but she was starting to look around without flinching when someone moved too quickly near her. "There you are," Mabel said, looking up from the flour. "I was just telling Jolene about the time you and Wren unclogged the chimney and nearly set the whole place on fire." "That was one time," Cora protested, sitting down at the familiar table. "One very memorable time." Mabel handed her a biscuit, still warm from the oven, butter melting into its golden surface. "You doing okay?" "Getting there." Biscuit trotted over and put his gray muzzle on Cora's knee. She scratched behind his ears, feeling the comfort of his presence, the simple gift of being needed. Outside the window, the mountains stood patient and eternal, keeping watch over the valley and the cabin and the woman who had found her purpose in the most unexpected place. That night, alone for the first time in nearly 18 years, Cora sat on the porch and looked at the stars. She thought about Ezra Harrington, hiding his treasure and waiting through the decades for someone worthy to find it. She thought about Opal, watching the road year after year, trusting that someday the right person would come. She thought about Hollis, who would never see what they had built, but whose spirit felt close tonight, somehow in the silence and the starlight. She thought about Wren, riding a bus toward a future full of possibilities that had once seemed impossible. And she thought about herself, about the woman who had arrived here 18 months ago, broken and terrified and convinced that her life was over. That woman was still inside her somewhere. Cora could feel her sometimes late at night, whispering old fears and old doubts. But she was not that woman anymore. She was something else now, something that had grown in the dark, like seeds pushing up through frozen ground toward a spring they could not see but somehow knew was coming. The cabin creaked softly behind her, settling into its bones for the night. Inside, she could hear Delphine humming something old and sweet while she got ready for bed. Somewhere in the guest room, Jolene's baby made small, satisfied sounds. Life. New life. Growing in a place that had been silent for so long. Cora folded Ezra's letter and tucked it back into her pocket where it had lived for months now, close to her heart. She would read it again someday when she needed reminding. She would pass it down to Ren when the time was right. And maybe someday Ren would pass it to someone else, continuing the chain of mercy that Ezra had started a century ago. But for now, she was content to sit here in the quiet, watching the stars wheel overhead, knowing that she had become something she never expected to be. Not a victim, not a survivor. Something more, a shelter, a refuge, a home. And in the cabin that no one wanted, in the mountains that kept their own counsel, Coraline Beckett finally understood what Ezra Harrington had hidden there all those years ago. Not $5 million. That was never really the point. The true inheritance was simpler and harder and worth more than any fortune. It was this: broken things can still shelter life. Dignity can return even after it has been stripped away. And sometimes the people who have lost the most are the only ones wise enough to turn wealth into mercy. Opal Harrington had waited 30 years on this very porch, watching the road, believing that someday the right person would come. She had not waited in vain, and neither had Cora. The end.